On October 20-5, 1940-4, in the Philippine Sea east of Samar Island, Ensign William Brooks's binoculars trembled slightly. He peered down from his Grun and TBF Avenger at 1,500 feet above the gray waters. He recorded words into his radio that would freeze the blood of every man in task units 70-7 point for point 3. Those are not our ships. From his vantage point on routine anti-minus submarine patrol launched from escort carrier USS Street, lo, he had just witnessed something. That something contradicted every assumption about where the Japanese fleet was supposed to be. Pagoda masts were rising from the horizon in the dim light of early morning. The distinctive profile of the largest battleship ever constructed was cutting through patches of mist. An entire armada of heavy cruisers and battleships was steaming at full speed. They were steaming directly towards 6 small escort carriers that possessed nothing capable of speed. Rear Admiral Clifton F. Sprague was commanding officer of Task Unit 70-7 point for point 3. He had been assured that the powerful Third Fleet under Admiral William F. Halsey protected his northern flank. The San Bernardino Strait between Luzon and Samar was supposedly blocked by American battleships. Yet here, materializing out of the early morning haze at Uro 637, came the full might of the Imperial Navy's center force. There were 4 battleships, including Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. They were against 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The mathematics of naval warfare were being rewritten not in tactical manuals, but in decisions. Those decisions would have to be made in the next 60 seconds. The impossible had occurred, and the response would trigger one of the most audacious actions in naval history. Tiny destroyers and destroyer escorts would charge battleships in a suicide run that should never have succeeded. The road to this moment began months earlier as American forces advanced relentlessly across the Pacific. By October 1940-4, the liberation of the Philippines had become the centerpiece of a Allied strategy. Recapturing the Philippine Islands would cut Japan's vital sea lanes to the oil resources of the Dutch East Indies. Those oil resources were the lifeblood of the Japanese war machine. General Douglas MacArthur was about to fulfill the promise he had made when leaving Corregidor in 1940-2. That promise was simple: I shall return. To support this invasion, the United States Navy assembled one of the most powerful fleets in history. The 7th Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, was tasked with protecting the invasion fleet. They were also tasked with providing close air support to the invading forces. The 3rd Fleet, commanded by Admiral William Bull Halsey, had powerful carrier task groups. Its mission was to find and destroy the main Japanese naval forces. But the Imperial Japanese Navy was not sitting idle. They had devised an extraordinarily complex plan codenamed Operation Shogo 1. This plan was a desperate gamble designed to exploit the egos and communication failures of American naval commanders. Japan would form a decoy fleet with what few aircraft carriers they had left. That decoy fleet would be commanded by Vice Admiral G. Saburo Ozawa. Its mission was to lure Halsey's 3rd Fleet north away from the landing beaches. Meanwhile, a powerful surface fleet commanded by Vice Admiral Takurita would transit the San Bernardino Strait. That fleet would attack the American invasion fleet from the north. Another Japanese fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, would transit the Surigao Strait. That fleet would attack from the south. The success of this plan depended on one critical assumption. That assumption was that Halsey would be drawn to Ozawa's decoy fleet. That would leave Kurita's battleships and cruisers to attack the vulnerable invasion transports. They would attack without interference. On October 20th, 1940-4, General MacArthur waded ashore on Leyte Island. He declared to cheering crowds that the people of the Philippines, he had returned. But even as American forces consolidated their beachhead, the Japanese fleet was on the move. On October 20-4, Halsey's reconnaissance aircraft spotted Ozawa's carrier fleet. This was exactly what the Japanese commanders wanted. Halsey, always eager for a decisive battle with Japanese aircraft carriers, immediately decided to take his entire Third Fleet north in pursuit. He believed that Kinkaid's 7th Fleet had sufficient strength to protect the invasion fleet. He also believed that, in any case, the San Bernardino Strait was being blocked by a powerful battleship task group he had left behind. But there was a fatal misunderstanding. Here Halsey had not left any battleships to guard the San Bernardino Strait at all. The task group that was supposed to be the guard force was actually something Halsey had formed to deal with Kurita's surface fleet. But when he decided to pursue Ozawa's carriers, he took the entire task group with him. Halsey sent a message to Kinkaid saying that his task force would proceed north with 3 task groups to attack at dawn tomorrow. Kinkaid believed this meant Halsey had left sufficient forces to guard the San Bernardino Strait. But the wording of this message was extraordinarily ambiguous. To make matters worse, due to the chaos and misunderstanding in radio communications, there was absolutely no clear understanding between the two fleets about who was doing what. Kurita's center force had been subjected to heavy air attacks from Halsey's carriers during the day on October 20-4. They suffered severe losses, including the sinking of the super battleship Mushoshi. Kurita temporarily withdrew, but by nightfall he turned east again, heading toward the San Bernardino Strait. Halsey's reconnaissance aircraft had stopped tracking Kurita's fleet because all attention was focused on Ozawa's decoy fleet. Late on the night of October 20-4, Kurita's fleet transited the San Bernardino Strait completely unopposed. This was one of the most astonishing intelligence failures in naval history. Kinkaid's 7th Fleet and Sprague's escort carrier task groups were completely unaware that a powerful fleet of battleships and heavy cruisers was bearing down on them. Sprague's task group, codenamed Taffy 3, consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Escort carriers were small carriers converted from merchant ships, slow and thinly armored. They were primarily used for anti-mine submarine patrol and providing close air support to ground forces. They were not designed to fight battleships. Taffy 3's destroyers were Fletcher- class destroyers, armed with 5-inch guns and torpedoes. But these weapons were absolutely insignificant compared to the 18-inch main guns of Japanese battleships. The destroyer escorts were even smaller, designed primarily for anti-mine submarine warfare. It's RO 637 on the morning of October 20-5, when Ensign Brooks's reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Japanese fleet. The officers and men of Taffy 3 were just beginning their daily routine. Rear Admiral Sprague initially thought those were Halsey's battleships, until Brooks's radio report made the truth clear. Those are Japanese ships. Sprague immediately ordered his carriers to turn into the wind so that aircraft could be launched. He also ordered them to lay down smoke screens to cover the fleet. But this was not enough. The Japanese battleships and cruisers were already within range, and their shells were starting to fall among the American ships. Commander Ernest Evans, captain of USS Johnston, was a half-minus Cherokee Native American from Oklahoma. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy class of 1931. He was known as an aggressive and fearless commander. It had also been known, to the amusement of his crew, to occasionally speak Cherokee over the radio during exercises. Evans did not hesitate. He ordered Johnston to lay down smoke and then turned directly toward the Japanese fleet. When Evans's executive office asked him what they were going to do, Evans reportedly said, "We're going to fight him." This was not part of any pre-planned tactical doctrine. It was simply a decision made by a single commander in the heat of the moment. Johnston's sister ships, Hull and Herman, quickly followed suit. Soon, the destroyer, escorts Samuel B., Roberts and Dennis, also joined the attack. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, captain of Samuel B. Roberts, gave a speech to his crew. That speech is now famous in naval history. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. This was not a speech about glory or victory. It was about doing what needed to be done, even when survival was impossible. It was about duty and honor and protecting their brothers in the carriers behind them. And so began one of the most extraordinary naval engagements in history. Johnston opened fire at maximum range, hitting the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano with her 5-inch guns. Kumano was hit in her bow, destroying her forward turret and setting her on fire. Evans then brought Johnston alongside the heavy cruiser at point-blank range and launched 10 torpedoes. One of those torpedoes hit Kumano, blowing off her entire bow. This incredible first attack by a single destroyer against an entire fleet of heavy cruisers and battleships shocked the Japanese commanders. They could not understand why a single destroyer would charge directly at an entire fleet of battleships and heavy cruisers. This confusion would play a critical role in the events to come. But Johnston's success came at a terrible cost. 3 14-inch shells from the Japanese battleship Congo struck Johnston, destroying her bridge and knocking out 3 of her 5-inch guns. Evans was wounded, losing 2 fingers on his left hand. But he refused to leave the bridge. He continued to direct the battle from the ship's fantail. Meanwhile, Hull was also in the thick of the fight. Commander Leon Kent Berger brought Hull as close as 3,000 yards to the Japanese battleships. That was suicide range against 18-inch guns. Hull launched torpedoes at the Japanese battleship Congo, narrowly missing her. But Congo and the other Japanese battleships and cruisers focused their fire on Hull. Hull was hit more than 40 times. She lost all power, all weapons, and finally sank at approximately 0855. Of her crew of 273, only 86 survived. Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort, was also fighting with incredible ferocity. Copeland brought his ship as close as 2,000 yards to the Japanese heavy cruisers. That was extraordinary bravery for a ship that was never designed to fight heavy cruisers. Roberts hit the Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai with more than 255-inch shells. Chokai was heavily damaged, set on fire, and eventually had to be scuttled by her crew. But Samuel B. Roberts's success also came at a terrible cost. 3 14-inch shells from the Japanese battleship Congo struck Roberts, tearing through her thin hull. She sank at approximately 0912. Of her crew of 224, 120 survived. Johnston, despite being severely damaged, continued to fight. Evans, wounded and with his ships severely damaged, continued to maneuver Johnston between the Japanese fleet and the American carriers. He laid down smoke screens to protect the carriers and even attacked Japanese destroyers that were attempting to finish off the American carrier Gambier Bay. Gambier Bay had been hit multiple times by Japanese shells and was sinking. She was the first American aircraft carrier sunk by surface gunfire in World War II. Johnston's heroic defense allowed most of Gambier Bay's crew to abandon ship safely. But Johnston was now completely alone, surrounded by the entire Japanese fleet. A Japanese destroyer closed in on Johnston and opened fire at point-blank range. Evans ordered Johnston to return fire, but it was too late. Johnston was hit repeatedly, and Evans finally gave the order to abandon ship at approximately 10:10. Johnston sank soon afterward. Commander Ernest Evans was never seen again after Johnston sank. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Meanwhile, as the destroyers and destroyer escorts fought their desperate rewrote action, Sprague's escort carriers were not idle. They launched every aircraft they had, even though many of those aircraft were not armed to attack battleships. Many of the fighters strafed the Japanese ships with their machine guns, even though they had no armor minus piercing ammunition or bombs. They dropped depth charges on the decks of Japanese battleships and cruisers, even though those weapons were designed to attack submarines. Some aircraft simply made dummy runs, diving at the Japanese ships without firing or dropping anything at all. All of this harassment, combined with the smoke screens laid by the destroyers and destroyer escorts, was having an effect. The Japanese fleet was having trouble maintaining formation. Ships were zigzagging wildly to avoid attacks that weren't even real. Kurita believed he was fighting Halsey's powerful Third Fleet. He also believed that those carriers had already launched their air strikes against him. He believed that Halsey's battleships would soon arrive and finish him off. He had no way of knowing that the American aircraft attacking him were armed only with machine guns and depth charges. He also had no way of knowing that Halsey's battleships were hundreds of miles to the north, chasing Ozawa's empty carriers. Kurita had been trained in a neon naval doctrine, emphasizing decisive fleet actions between battleships. He expected his opponents to maneuver cautiously, preserving strength for the climactic engagement. Weaker forces were supposed to retreat when confronted by superior strength, not attack suicidally. The American destroyers violated every assumption about how a weaker force should behave. This confusion and uncertainty contributed materially to Kurita's decision to retreat. At approximately 0920, Kurita gave the order to retire north. He believed he had achieved a decisive victory. He had no idea that the American carriers he faced were not fleet carriers. He believed he was fighting Halsey's powerful Third Fleet. He also believed those carriers had already launched their air strikes against him. But the American carriers' aircraft were not attacking his fleet. They were too busy trying to save their own ships from destruction. Their aircraft were armed with depth charges and general-purpose bombs for anti-minus submarine and close air support missions. They had no armor-piercing bombs to effectively attack battleships. Kurita had no way of knowing any of this. He received reports that Halsey's carriers were approaching from the north. He feared being caught between two American carrier forces. He also received reports that the invasion beaches were not where he thought they were. The combination of exhaustion, poor communications, and mistaken intelligence led him to retreat. He ordered his fleet to retire north. The American sailors could not believe their eyes as the massive Japanese fleet turned away. They had been facing certain destruction just moments before. Now their enemy was voluntarily leaving the battlefield. It was one of the most astonishing turnarounds in naval history. The Battle of Samar was over, but the fighting was not quite done. The escort carrier Street, low, already damaged in the battle, would soon face a new horror. At approximately 10:50, a Japanese kamikaze aircraft, a Zero fighter, crashed into Street, low. This was the first successful kamikaze attack of the war. Street, low sank 30 minutes later. Of her crew of 880, 114 died. The survivors of Taffy 3 were now in the water, facing a new ordeal. Many would spend up to 50 hours in the water before rescue ships arrived. They faced dehydration, exposure, and shark attacks. Many watched friends and shipmates die before their eyes. The psychological trauma of survivors, guilt and post-traumatic stress, would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. The aftermath of the battle produced immediate recognition of the extraordinary valor displayed by Taffy 3. The entire task unit was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest unit decorations. The citation praised the extraordinary heroism and action against powerful units of the Japanese fleet. It noted specifically that two of the unit's valiant destroyers and one destroyer escort charged the battleships point-blank. They expended their last torpedoes in desperate defense of the entire group. They went down under the enemy's heavy shells as a climax to 2 and 1-half hours of sustained combat. Commander Ernest Evans posthumously received the Medal of Honor. His citation emphasized his role as the first to lay a smokescreen and open fire. It noted that he launched the first torpedo attack when Johnston came under straddling Japanese shell fire. The citation concluded that his valiant fighting spirit will endure as an inspiration to all. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's most astonishing naval battles, smash that like button and subscribe. I'm your naval history observer. I'll see you on the next high seas adventure.